Alright guys, welcome back to Holiday History. In this particular video, we're going to be taking a look at Independence Day. The 4th of July, a summer holiday. So, it's interesting, you'll notice that some holidays always fall on the same calendar day, and some always fall on the same day of the week. So like Christmas is always going to be December 25th. And December 25th could sometimes be on a Monday, it could be on a Tuesday, it could be a Wednesday. Easter, on the other hand, it's always going to be a Sunday. It might be April the 1st, it might be April 2nd or 3rd or whatever, but it'll always be a Sunday. July 4th is one of those holidays like Christmas where it's always July 4th. And it can fall on any day of the week. The reason July 4th is considered Independence Day is that it was back in July 4th of 1776 that the Continental Congress formally adopted the Declaration of Independence, which had been primarily written by Thomas Jefferson, which declared that the United States was going to be an independent, separate nation from Great Britain. There were a lot of things that led to this. The biggest thing was that the American colonists felt like King George in England was not being fair to them. They were being taxed and forced to pay taxes without really being given any kind of voice that would represent them in Parliament, which was making all these decisions about taxes. So the big cry of the colonists was taxation without representation. They wanted a voice in how they were going to be governed. And this led to increasing friction with England. It led eventually to a war, the Revolutionary War. George Washington was the leader of the American Army in the Revolutionary War. The war went on for a long time. So I remember as a kid, I used to think that 1776 was the year that America became free from England. That was the end of it. Well, really, that was the beginning of the struggle. The war didn't end for another 7 or 8 years after the Declaration of Independence. The colonists regarded themselves as free, but England didn't agree that they were free. England didn't come around to agree with that until many years later. The Declaration of Independence is one of the most beautiful documents ever written in American history. And it kind of sets the foundation for how Americans viewed government and how they viewed themselves. Thomas Jefferson wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." So, right there at the very beginning of America being founded as a nation was this principle of equality, that all men are created equal. Now, America has not always lived up to that principle of equality, but it's always been in the background as a guiding principle that that most Americans, at least today, realize we ought to at least try to live up to. In 1776, when this document was written, slavery was legal. Women certainly didn't have a lot of rights; they didn't have the right to vote. So it really meant all free men are equal, which sounds pretty narrow by today's standards, but for the time, even that was a step in a different direction. I mean, just to assert the equality of people. And as time has passed, that understanding has been expanded, where we now regard it as not just being white men or men and women, but all people, white men, black women, all people are created equal. And that means that they all have equal rights before the law. In addition to saying all men are created equal, he says, and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. So the American principle of human rights is that we get our rights from our Creator. We don't derive our rights as people from the government. We have these rights because our Creator has given us these rights. And that's important because a right that the government doesn't give you is a right that the government can't take away from you. when the Bill of Rights, which we're going to look at in a minute, was passed by Congress in the 1780s, the Founding Fathers didn't view that as a document that was giving the American people rights. They didn't view themselves as creating rights for the people. The Bill of Rights, rather, was a recognition that people, just by virtue of being people, have certain God-given rights, and the Bill of Rights was a pledge that Congress was making not to interfere with those God-given rights. That's profoundly important. Profoundly important because if rights are God-given, if humans, by virtue of being humans, have certain inherent rights, that empowers people when their governments abuse them to stand up and say, no, you can't take this right away from me because you didn't give me this right. God gave me this right, and therefore I possess this right, whether you recognize the right or not. I do possess this right as a human being. That's incredibly important. All right, so when I think of Independence Day, the main thing that I really like to celebrate, honestly, personally, is the Bill of Rights. I think it's what sets America apart from other nations that don't as explicitly and emphatically safeguard people's civil liberties. I think if you look at America today, pretty much any problem in society, in some way or other, is traced to people's the Bill of Rights in some way not being properly adhered to or followed. So I'm going to read a little bit. This is from the World Book Encyclopedia, describing a little bit about the Bill of Rights. All right. The Bill of Rights is a document that describes the fundamental liberties of the people. It also forbids the government to violate these rights. The Constitution of many democratic countries have bills of rights that guarantee everyone the freedoms of speech, of religion, and of the press, and of the right of assembly. Individuals are considered to be born with certain inalienable rights, that is, rights that governments may not take away from them. These rights are considered to be a part of a higher law, a body of universal principles of right and justice that is superior to laws created by governments. Some of these rights, such as the freedom of speech and of the press, support democracy. Others, such as the right to trial by jury, are essential to justice. This principle of inalienable rights is rooted in the idea that God is our creator, and that God gives us our dignity and our humanity and our rights as people. The idea is that human governments can determine what's legal, but they can't determine what's moral. God, as the ultimate higher standard, determines what's moral. And human laws are really only valid or only legitimate insofar as they conform to this higher law. St. Augustine, one of the early church Christian leaders in the 5th century, once said an unjust law is no law at all. And what he meant by that was, if a government passes a law that's unfair or dehumanizing to people, then from God's perspective, it's not a legitimate law. And Martin Luther King Jr. During the Civil Rights era kind of echoed that. He said that just as it's immoral to disobey a just law, it's immoral to obey an unjust law. Many of these ideas in the Bill of Rights were developed in ancient Greek and Roman civilizations. In modern history, individuals such as the philosophers John Locke and John Stuart Mill, John Milton, Thomas Paine, and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison fought for the acceptance of these views. All right, so we're going to take a look at the Bill of Rights now. Alrighty. This was adopted by Congress on December the 15th, 1791. The Bill of Rights was written by James Madison, who's nicknamed the father of our Constitution. All right, Amendment 1. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So there are 5 fundamental freedoms that are specifically mentioned in the First Amendment. And the first freedom is freedom of religion. This means that the government will not tell people what they can and can't believe, and what they should and shouldn't do as regards religious practice. We kind of take for granted as Americans, well, of course the government doesn't have any business telling people what to do as far as their religious decisions are concerned. But this was a revolutionary idea at the time. Throughout history up until this time, it was just kind of taken for granted that the ruler of a particular country would determine what religion the people of that country had to follow. And so the idea of just letting the people decide for themselves what religion they were going to follow and let the government kind of take a hands-off approach was a very revolutionary idea at the time. And of course today that means that people have the freedom to practice their religion. And they can't be bullied by the government into believing things that are contrary to their religion or acting in a way that's contrary to their religion. This freedom is under attack, as most of our civil liberties in America today are under attack in some way or another. The freedom of religion is particularly under attack. There are frequently laws that get passed that violate people's religious freedoms, and oftentimes these cases get taken all the way to the United States Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is the ultimate arbiter of which laws that Congress passes are constitutional or not constitutional. Anyway, so freedom of religion is the first freedom. Freedom of speech is the second one. That means that people have the right to speak their opinions. They have the right to speak freely. In some countries, it's against the law to criticize the government. It's against the law to say something negative about your government. But in America, people have the right to speak their mind. Again, this is a freedom that's also under attack. But those that defend this freedom point out, I believe, quite reasonably that the freedom to speak your mind is a God-given right, and because the government doesn't really give you that right, they don't have the right to take it away either. The third right is freedom of the press. This means that newspapers, magazines, internet websites, televisions, whatever we mean by the press today, all these entities have the freedom to report accurately what is happening in our society. In communist dictatorships, the government controls the press. Like in communist China, the only news that can be reported is the news the government approves of. That was true during the days of the USSR as well. In the Soviet Union, there was no free press. So if the government was doing things wrong, the people weren't being made aware of what the government was doing wrong because the government made sure that information never got out. But in America, a free press means that the government is held accountable. And that's really the role of the press. That's really the role of journalism, is to make sure that the government leaders do not encroach upon the rights of people. I think, unfortunately, today, most journalists don't really function that way. Most journalists don't seek to hold the government accountable. The field of journalism is very corrupt, in my opinion, today. But that's supposed to be their role. The fourth is the right of the people peaceably to assemble. And that's a right that's desperately under attack right now. All of the shelter-in-place orders, for example, that local governments have passed in an effort to curb the coronavirus. However, whatever the rationale is for these shelter-in-place orders or whatever defense is given for them, the fact is they violate people's right to assemble. You have the right to assemble. No government leader can tell you that you can't assemble with your friends, whether it's at church or in the community. And to be told that you can't assemble is a violation of your human rights. You have the right to assemble. And again, that's not a right the government gave you. So therefore, the government can't take that right away from you. It's a God-given right. And thankfully, there are some people who are protesting that in saying, as American citizens, as humans, we have the right to assemble, and that's an inalienable right. No one can take that away from us, and that's a right that doesn't go away, even in the midst of a pandemic. We don't lose our human rights just because there's a pandemic. We still retain our human rights. And then the fifth one, the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. That means the people have the right to protest to the government when the government is doing things that are wrong. They have the right to make their voices heard. The First Amendment is very fundamental. If we lose the First Amendment, all is lost. That's really the safeguard that protects our freedoms as Americans. The Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. This is one of the more controversial amendments today. People debate about what types of firearms citizens ought to have, if any. I think that the rationale behind the Second Amendment at the time was, again, the Founding Fathers were cynical about governments tending to be bullyish. That they'd experienced a lot of government bullying from King George in England. And so the Bill of Rights was largely intended to help people safeguard their liberties and make sure that the government didn't become a bully. But that's just a natural tendency. Governments tend to do that. So it says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. In order for people to be free, in order for citizens to retain their freedom, they have to have the freedom to be armed and defend themselves against government tyranny. So it says the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. There's a lot of debate today about whether private citizens ought to have assault weapons and things like that. And I think people can come to different conclusions about those kind of questions. I think it's interesting, though, that the kinds of weapons that private citizens would have had in 1791 when this amendment was passed would have been the same kind of weapons that the government had. There was no difference between high powerful military weapons and ordinary citizen weapons. They were the same. Because of course if the government has more powerful weapons than the citizens again have no safeguard to protect themselves against tyranny. All right, Amendment 3. No soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. In the Revolutionary War, British soldiers could force their way into people's homes and demand that they be housed and taken and fed. And this amendment was to make sure that never happened again. Number 4, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. This is meant to be a safeguard against people being, again, abused by government or abused by police. If you're suspected of a crime, for instance, and the police want to search your home, they can't just barge in and do that. They have to have a search warrant, according to the Constitution, and they're not supposed to be able to get a search warrant unless there's probable cause, which means there's a reasonable case to be made that for saying they really need to search your home. They can't just do it arbitrarily or for the heck of it. This is to protect people and their private property from being interfered with or tampered with by the government. Amendment number 5. No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on presentment of or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in the land or naval forces or in the militia when in actual service in time of war or public danger. Nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb, nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. There's a lot packed into the Fifth Amendment. 4 of the 10 amendments in the Bill of Rights pertain the rights of people who are accused of crimes. So clearly the Founding Fathers understood the extreme importance of safeguarding people's liberties even when they're accused of some kind of crime. To be accused is not the same thing as being guilty. Innocent people get accused a lot of things, and so the principle that the Bill of Rights kind of establishes is this principle of innocent until proven guilty. Whatever you're accused of, you have the right to a fair trial. You have the right to be presumed or believed to be innocent until you're proven guilty. And you have rights as an accused criminal. You have the right to not even go to trial unless a grand jury indicts you. You shouldn't have to be put on trial unless a grand jury has decided there's enough evidence to have a trial. You can't be tried for the same crime twice. So, like, if you're acquitted by a jury, you can't be arrested and tried again for the same crime if you've already been acquitted by a jury. You can't be forced to testify against yourself. If you're on trial and you're being asked a very awkward question, you can say, I plead the Fifth Amendment, and that means I don't have to answer that question. I have the right to not answer that question. And it says no one can be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. It means you can't just be locked up in jail and kept there indefinitely without being charged with a crime and given a trial. You can't. You have to have due process. You can't have things taken away from you without due process. You can't be put in prison without due process. In America today, this is a right that is frequently violated, but the Bill of Rights is meant to prevent people's rights from being violated. Amendment number 6. In all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury of the state and district wherein the crime shall have been committed, which district shall have been previously ascertained by law, and to be informed of the nature and cause of the accusation, to be confronted with the witnesses against him, to have compulsory process for obtaining witnesses in his favor, and to have the assistance of counsel for his defense. This means that if you're accused of a crime, you have the right to a fair trial, a speedy trial. It means it shouldn't drag on for years. A public trial, which means what's happening should be public knowledge, so that if the court system is acting corruptly, the people should be made aware of it. Secret trials that the public have no knowledge of, that's an anti-American concept. The person who's accused has the right to be informed of all the details of the accusation. You have the right to confront your accuser. If someone accuses you of a crime, you have the right to confront that person in court and ask them questions. And again, this is a right that's constantly trampled in our society today. But according to the Bill of Rights, you can't be charged with a crime and convicted of a crime if the person who accused you of the crime isn't present to be cross-examined in court. That's what this amendment is saying. You have the right to obtain witnesses in your own favor, and you have the right to an attorney to defend you. There are some courts today that don't give the accused an attorney, and that's a flagrant violation of the Sixth Amendment. Number 7, it's in suits at common law where the value in controversy shall exceed $20, the right of trial by jury shall be preserved, and no fact tried by a jury shall be otherwise re-examined in any court of the United States than according to the rules of the common law. So that's saying that in lawsuits, juries should be the ones that decide the outcome if it exceeds $20. Number 8, excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. This is to make sure that people, even if they're convicted of a crime, are not treated in an inhumane way. Cruel and unusual punishments are not to be inflicted. And of course, there's some debate about what exactly that means. What constitutes cruel and unusual punishment? But the idea is that even if you're a convicted criminal, you still have certain human rights. You might forfeit some of your legal rights, but you don't forfeit your human rights. You can't be put in prison and tortured, for example. Number 9, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. That means that this document can't possibly list every single right that you have, and it's saying don't think that just because a right isn't explicitly mentioned in this document that you therefore don't have the right. There's nothing in the Bill of Rights about having the right to get up in the morning and brush your teeth, or having the right to watch TV, or having the right to go out to eat at a restaurant, or having the right to go to shop at your favorite store. But you obviously have those rights. This is just saying don't think that every right has to be listed in this document for you to have it. Then number 10 says the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. And that's just saying that unless it specifically spells out that the federal government has authority in some area, unless that's specifically said in the Constitution, then the authority, instead of belonging to the federal government, would belong then rather to the state or local government, or just to the people themselves. So that's addressing the balance of federal government versus state government. States' rights versus the rights of the nation. All right, I know it's a lot, and you may wonder what all this has to do with Independence Day, but to me, this is what we're celebrating on Independence Day. We're celebrating that we have a Constitution that says you as a human being matter, and you have certain rights that can't be taken away. And this is what our ancestors spilled their blood to secure for us. This is what they died to give us, these freedoms, these rights. So we should all celebrate these rights.